Good morning and welcome. My name's Raleigh Flynn, and I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. This morning, we're going to be having a very interesting discussion on the future of the Wagner Group in Africa. I think we were all riveted over the last few months with the goings on of Wagner's CEO, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and his recent death in the plane crash has raised some questions about what the future of the Wagner Group will be. Since it's Russia's primary military contractor, and it's been operating in Africa and primarily in the Sahel since around 2017. So I will not go into a lot of details on that because we have some very qualified folks this morning who can talk about that. Leading our conversation will be Ambassador Charles Ray, who's a member of FPRI's Board of Trustees and the chair of FPRI's Africa program. He had a long career in the US State Department, serving as ambassador in Zimbabwe, ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia. Before that, he had a 20-year career in the US Army with postings in Europe and Asia, including 2 tours in Vietnam during the war. Our expert this morning who'll be talking to us is Clarissa Rodio. She's a barrister practicing in London, England, and she has expertise in international criminal law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law. She's dealt with matters before international courts, including the Criminal Court, European Court of Human Rights, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and the Kosovo Specialist Chambers. Her research primarily focuses on mercenaries and private military contractors, particularly the Wagner Group and their activities in Ukraine and Africa. So it should be a very, very interesting and relevant discussion. Before I turn the reins over to Ambassador Ray, I'd just like to give a reminder that we will take your questions roughly halfway through the program. So please put them in the Q&A box. Please start doing that now, so that when the time comes, we sometimes don't have a lot of questions, and then we have a lot of questions right as we're running out of time. So if we could pace ourselves, it'd be great. Finally, I'd like to thank those of you in the audience who are members of our board, supporters, members, donors to FPRI. I'm often saying the content is free to you, it's not free to us, and so we are very, very grateful for your support. The video of this morning's discussion will also be posted on our FPRI's YouTube channel after the fact. That usually takes about 24 hours to get that on, more or less. So without further ado, Ambassador Ray, the chair is yours.
Thank you, and welcome to our audience. I can see from the number of people here that this is going to be a topic that's of great interest, and so I'm not going to talk much. I'm going to let our distinguished panelist, barrister Clarissa Rodio, talk. She's going to give about a 15 or 20-minute introduction of the topic, and then a very brief conversation, and then at the 30-minute mark we will turn it over to you all to answer your questions. And as President Flynn said, please put your questions in the Q&A so we don't miss them. We'd like to try and get to as many of them as possible. And so now, Ms. Rodio, would you take the floor?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this webinar. And I also would like to thank the audience for their time. First of all, I would like to introduce this webinar by providing some background information, including what we have been observing lately in relation to the several coups in Africa, followed by a discussion of the Wagner's presence in Central African Republic and Mali. And this will hopefully provide some helpful background in order to get to Niger, as in my view, there is a visible pattern, but of course, I welcome any observations on this. And finally, all this information will give an idea of what the future holds for Wagner in Africa. What I would like to introduce the webinar with first is there are 2 international conventions that deal with mercenaries. And I will come back to this in a moment. But these apply in situations of international and non-international armed conflicts, whose purpose is to eradicate them through the criminalization of their activities. And the first one is the UN Convention against the recruitment, use, financing, and training of mercenaries. And the second one is the OAU Convention for the elimination of mercenarism in Africa. These are the mercenary conventions. And according to the mercenary conventions, mercenarism is considered a crime, and individuals who satisfy the definition of a mercenary can be prosecuted. So now the Wagner Group is, as you know, is not a single legal entity, but a network of corporations. And Utkin and Prigozhin started the Wagner Group, which emerged around 2014. They were first involved in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. And it was at this time that the Wagner Group began to crystallize. And then among Prigozhin's other endeavors, there was this internet research agency, the IRA, a troll farm that he established in 2013. And the IRA promoted conspiracy theories, pro-Putin propaganda in various social media platforms. It was also used to influence campaigns seeking to affect the outcome of elections in Western countries. And then gradually, Wagner's activities expanded to the Middle East and Africa, including Syria, Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, Mozambique, and Madagascar. And the mercenaries acted as bodyguards for government leaders, conducted military operations alongside the regular armies of those countries. And Prigozhin also secured valuable mineral contracts for himself and the Russian government. Since 2006, President Putin tried to rebuild Russia's presence and role in Africa, which has considerably weakened following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And Moscow signed 19 military collaboration agreements with African governments between 2015 and 2019, which primarily focused on Russian weapons sales. However, by the time Russia's influence in Africa expanded, it has concentrated on the deployment of PSCs, so private security contractors, in order to deliver counterinsurgency and counterterrorism training, as well as advising to local governments. What is clear is that the Wagner's activities coexist with Russia's foreign policy objectives, and the nature of their activities and affiliation is capable of being compared and amalgamated with mercenary activities, and their status can be defined as dynamic and mutable. Now, what we've been observing is a series of coups in Africa. 6 countries in Africa have had military takeovers since 2020, which includes Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Niger, and Gabon, all former French colonies. And we have seen African people protesting against France and a popular support for coup leaders. And a common feature that combines all these countries together is the lack of economic growth. There is corruption and insecurity. And in fact, the security issues are dire, especially in the Sahel, where armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIL are placed. And as a result of this, the African population could not deal with their government's failures any longer. And in fact, the justification that the coup leaders in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have given for taking power was based on the security problem. And furthermore, as previously mentioned, we have seen an incredible opposition to France in its role. These countries were former French colonies, and the relationship rooted in the slave trade. And many people felt that throughout these years, such exploitation has not ceased, but it continued in new ways. This is known as neo-colonialism. And nevertheless, the people in Niger, in other countries such as Mali and others particularly, blamed the French for not solving their problems and by instead exploiting their resources and leaving them in poverty. And in relation to the security threat in the Sahel, the people have seen the extent of the French troops' intervention in fighting the armed groups, but their feelings towards France became worse. And what's more, there is a growing support for Russia following some coups. Russian flags were being waved. And what is worth noting also that President Putin on the 28th of July, 2023, at the Russia-Africa Summit, said that there is a common will between Russia and African countries to fight against neo-colonialism. And in fact, Russia has increased its influence through the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group has achieved access to resources, have been successful in undermining the credibility of the West as well. And there are 64 companies linked to Prigozhin. More than half of those used by Wagner as a complex network of front companies to hide the flow of money connected to the Russian government. And in Africa, Wagner also set up shell companies to mine natural resources and sell them around the globe. And it was able to do that by offering security services. The biggest presence of Wagner has been in Dakar, the Central African Republic, and Mali. And in 2018, Wagner forces arrived in Dakar in order to defend the regime of President Touadéra against successive rebel attacks in the capital, Bangui. And they have been accused of human rights abuses. And they've also provided military training to Dakar special forces and protecting diamond and oil fields. However, Wagner began taking over the mines. One of the largest is the Ndasima gold mine. They cleared the area of rebels and they effectively took full control of the mine. And a Wagner company that is named Milda Resources was created for mining in Dakar. And the Wagner fighters killed anyone in their way. And there was, in fact, a massacre, which is well known, called which occurred in the village of Boyo, the Boyo massacre in 2021. And there is, in fact, it was documented in the 2022 UN Human Rights Council report. And there is this narrative of Russia as a friend, as a helper in various forms of propaganda and disinformation. I give some examples by way of Soviet art-style billboards in Dakar, as well as children's cartoons. And there is another example of a Russian propaganda film called Tourist, which glorifies the Wagner Group fighting against the rebels. The UN peacekeepers were portrayed as being essentially weak and useless, and the French colonialists planning to return to power. And it was made with Car's government full support, where the president in that film was played by a relative of President Touadéra. And in this film, of course, the Russians win. The Russian mercenaries were presented as heroes. And so Russia was portrayed as a savior of the Car. And it is interesting to know that following the failed mutiny in June, Car's advisor to President Touadéra said that in 2018, Car signed a defense agreement with Russia, not with Wagner, and therefore, should Russia no longer have an agreement with Wagner, they will send them a new contingent. And this demonstrates a complete denial by African countries such as Car having any connection whatsoever with Wagner, which presents serious issues. In theory, Wagner employees are known to provide security services. They are instructors, when in fact they actively participate in hostilities and commit serious human rights abuses. And in addition to Car, Russia has taken advantage of the West absence, as well as the anti-French sentiments, a sentiment in countries such as Mali and Sudan, for example, and then in a moment we'll get to Niger. Wagner deployed about 1,000 personnel in Mali in December 2021 after a military coup, have been deployed against Islamists and other insurgents. And when Wagner came, the French military was removed soon afterwards. In fact, the departure of the French troops in 2022 and the UN peacekeeping missions MINUSMA in 2023 has been followed by a surge of jihadist and rebel violence. And the country has been relying on Wagner to fight the jihadists, and Wagner has been involved in gold and diamond mining, as well as, there has been strengthening its positions by providing the junta with PMC services in exchange of securing mining concessions. In relation to Niger, in 2016, Niger and Russia signed an agreement to allow the two countries to strengthen the security and development. And President Bazoum was democratically elected in 2021. He was making changes to the military leadership, and General Chiani essentially turned on him. And on the 28th of July, he announced himself as the head of the military junta. Naturally, such events in Niger present an opportunity for Russia and the Wagner Group. And whilst it has been stated that Russian government had no role in the coup, the opposition groups in Niger, such as the M62 movement, took advantage of this coup in order to advance their political plan, namely a French military withdrawal from Niger. There has been a dramatic increase in the sighting of Russian flags throughout Niger, especially in the capital, Niamey. There was a massive demonstration in Niamey on the 4th of September, demanding the departure of French troops from Niger. And Niger has been the target of Russian disinformation campaigns, in particular following the coup in Burkina Faso in October 2022. However, relations are positive between the junta in Niamey and the transitional regime in Mali. And it is worth noting that Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, condemned the coup, as well as the potential intervention from ECOWAS. The Wagner Group, praised the coup and saw it as a step towards independence from the West. And ECOWAS, backed by France and led by Nigeria's President Tinubu, did threaten military intervention to reinstate Bazoum. And in fact, Niger's coup generals asked for help from Wagner because of this, but in the end, ECOWAS has not acted. And considering this, on the one hand, deploying Wagner to Niger could be detrimental because of other actors potentially preparing to intervene. And Russia would not want to put its Africa policy in jeopardy. On the 28th of July, at the Russia-Africa Summit, President Putin pledged closer ties with Nigeria and other African countries, which included a pledge to tackle the food crisis. And furthermore, potential deployment of Wagner could create an environment leading to a rise of terrorism. But on the other hand, though, just last week, on the 10th of October, the French military convoys left Niger via road to Chad. And the conditions of insecurity might contribute to a division between a desire for change on behalf of the people in Niger and those who prefer the military junta, which could potentially cause a military intervention and potential involvement of Wagner. The absence of Western troops might in fact present an opportunity now, but based on what I've stated previously, it is arguable that what could be possible is that the junta could strengthen the ties with Russia's PMCs, and Russian instructors would be deployed mainly for training purposes in a similar way like in Burkina Faso, as opposed to Mali, for example, where Wagner has been actively involved in fighting the jihadists. So this is my view in relation to the deployment, potentially deployment of Wagner in Niger. But there is also a new alliance that has been reported on the 16th of September. The military leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso signed the Liptako-Gourma Charter, a mutual defense pact establishing a new alliance between these three countries, three states of the Sahel, and a commitment to assistance that is capable of having deterrent effects against an external actor that represents a threat. And when some of the members of ECOWAS threatened to intervene militarily in Niger over the coup, Mali and Burkina Faso responded by stating that any such operation would be considered as a declaration of war against them. So this pact essentially binds three countries to work to prevent armed rebellions. Now, I'm not sure, Charles, if you suggest I would move on to the OAU Convention on mercenarism, on the elimination of mercenarism in Africa. But if I'm not sure whether I can carry on this, if there is time.
Well, why don't we hold that? And I think there is actually a chance in some of the Q&A from the audience to do that. But I would like to ask a question. Well, before I get to a question that I have, I noticed that one member of the audience has a hand up. Please, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. We don't have the facility to allow audience members to speak. Now, I have a question for you, and this is sort of the future of Wagner Group. As you mentioned, it's a large complex of different shell companies and organizations that are scattered all over the place. And with the death of Prigozhin and the top leadership of Wagner Group, for that matter, that sort of leaves all of these companies, their propaganda arm, their intelligence gathering arm, and a lot of the commercial entities leaderless, at least in terms of the top of the pyramid. So I was reading somewhere that several agencies of the Russian government were scrambling to gain control of, for example, the propaganda arm and the intelligence gathering arm. How do you see that affecting the future of Wagner Group in Africa, this scramble for Wagner, so to speak?
Well, the reality is that Wagner's presence in Africa, especially in the current Sahel, well, only destabilized it in order to advance their self-serving interests, but that's effectively Russia's interests, by offering security services to countries that have lucrative natural resources and armed conflict as well. Whether Wagner will continue to live and operate following Prigozhin's demise, it is arguable that there is little interest in disassembling Wagner, because it would amount to effectively losing Russia's influence in Africa. And Russia is basically a security guarantor, and that appears to remain unchanged, has offered regime security, and that has already been agreements put forward by the West based on Africa's development of through institutional capacity building. And surely the disinformation campaigns by Russia contributed to this anti-Western sentiment in Africa. There are rumors that this was a prominent Wagner-affiliated Telegram channel announced on the 1st of October, so very recently, that Prigozhin's son has taken over command of the Wagner Group. And essentially, Pavel, that's his son, Pavel Prigozhin, is negotiating with Rosgvardia about the Wagner Group rejoining combat operations in Ukraine. There was also a document shared on a Telegram channel, which has not been independently verified, that suggests that Prigozhin had a will that was notarized on the 2nd of March of this year, and bequeathed most of his inheritance to his son. So he, in fact, said, around these words, all my property, as well as property that may be acquired by me in the future, I bequeath to Pavel Prigozhin, So there is a possibility that all these companies, even the shell companies that Wagner created, well, these were thanks to Yevgeny Prigozhin, and therefore but there is a possibility that Prigozhin will have some control of those. But there is also there was reported Trojev having command of taking over command of the Wagner Group. So there is no certain answer to that, but these companies will continue, and that there is a possibility. And even Foreign Minister Lavrov, following the failed mutiny by Prigozhin in June, stated that Wagner Group would continue to operate in Dakar, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Libya. So the Kremlin did send a clear message that it would maintain its presence in Africa. The Wagner has been very successful not only in exploiting African natural resources by signing energy and mining deals, but these information campaigns have considerably contributed to showing this narrative that all Western activities in Africa are founded on neocolonialism, that Western countries are once exploiting resources for their own prosperity. So Wagner is, in my view, is a going concern and will continue to operate in the foreseeable future. The way in which it will operate arguably would be with greater oversight from Russia. And there is still a possibility of a complete rebranding of Wagner. Of course, that takes time. So it might well continue in a different form. And there is a lot of demand and supply of Russian mercenaries. And what must be noted is that there are at least 37 Russian PMCs, all connected to Russia. And before Prigozhin's death, the Russian Defense Ministry they began recruiting fighters in Africa through two PMCs in particular, Convoy and Redoubt. And Redoubt, for instance, has been also fighting in Ukraine. Hope that answers partly the question, at least.
It sounds complicated. I have another question, and this is put your prognostication hat on for this one. The Russians, Wagner Group and Russia writ large, has been somewhat successful, especially in the Sahel, of painting the French as colonial exploiters because the people haven't gotten the benefit of their own natural resources. So the French are out, or at least mostly out, and Wagner and the Russians are in. But the people are still poor. They're still suffering extremist attacks. Do you see the potential for ECOWAS or even others in the West at some point being able to counter the Russian disinformation by showing that the people have thrown their lot in with the Russians and their lot hasn't improved?
This is this is not an easy question. There are many possibilities. I don't have the right answer to this, and of course, I'm still researching on Wagner activities in Africa. So my research is ongoing. I don't see ECOWAS doing anything to prevent this, but actually, what I would see is perhaps more support for Russia, and slowly, what I see is Russia slowly expanding more and more influence in Africa.
Interesting. Okay, we have one of our largest audiences to date, and already the Q&A box is full, and I don't want to disadvantage the audience. So at this point, I will turn it back over to our esteemed president, Raleigh Flynn, to moderate the questions from the audience.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. And we have a lot of questions. So we'll just dive right in, and maybe if we can keep our answers short, we'll try to get to as many as we can. The first question, does Russian Wagner presence in Africa have any positives, or is its influence entirely malignant? Also, can you provide more insights about human rights violations by Wagner in the Central African Republic, for example?
Yes, sure. So one example is the Boyo massacre that I've stated previously. That's one of the many crimes that Wagner fighters have committed. But in Mali, for instance, Wagner has been accused of widespread atrocities. In March 2022, the UN Human Rights Office reported that more than 500 people were killed in Mali by Malian troops and foreign military personnel that were believed to be from Wagner during an operation that took place over 5 days in the Moura village. And the UN said that at least 58 women and girls were raped or subject to other forms of sexual violence during the operation, which of course do amount to war crimes and arguably crimes against humanity. And that's
the question is, are there any positives?
Are any positives? What do you mean by that?
Well, it says, does Russia Wagner presence in Africa have any positives, or is its influence entirely malignant?
It is entirely malignant. That's my view in relation.
So there are no positives, in other words.
Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. Let me move on to the next question. What intersection, if any, is there between the Wagner Group and China in Africa?
As I said, my research is ongoing. I don't really touch on Chinese PMCs. I do not have a definite answer on that. I don't see Wagner with China, but what I see is China imitating the Wagner model. Mm-hmm. Because Prigozhin has left a legacy, and the Wagner model, it will be imitated by other authoritarian countries such as China. Mm-hmm. What we could see is something like Russia and Wagner in Ukraine.
Thank you. That's interesting. Another question, what are the legal implications of the UK having declared Wagner a terrorist organization in terms of Wagner's operations?
Yes, the UK, the same way as the US, have declared Wagner as a terrorist organization. We must not forget 9/11 and the war on terror, because Al-Qaeda also were treated as unlawful combatants, so that can have implications in relation to human rights. And I'm not sure how being designated as a terrorist organization has it has consequences, but I would be very careful with that, especially when it has to do with distinguishing between combatants and civilians. And by designating them as terrorists, that can have implications with categorizing them as unlawful combatants, which has problems. And we have the example of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question about Wagner. Not a question precisely about Wagner, but about Russia and Africa. Do we know the truth of whether or not South Africa supplied weapons to Russia this year? And perhaps I'll add Ambassador Ray to that, because there's been much discussion about the South African-Russian relationship and whether weapons really went to South Africa.
Well, if I could, I'll just give a quick answer from what I know, and then let Clarissa take. There was a I don't know if you could call it an investigation or a study. The South African president directed that this issue be looked into, and then concluded recently, just a couple of months ago, I think, that there was no evidence to support it. But the full report was never made public, and so there are still questions. And of course, without having access to very sensitive intelligence, which we don't, there's no way of knowing if what looked like a highly suspicious bit of movement of a commercial vessel that went into a South African military base, whether what happened there still remains unknown.
Okay. Okay. Would you like to add to that, Clarissa?
No, absolutely right, Ambassador Ray.
What are the U.S. and the West doing to counter Wagner and Russia? What has worked? What has not? What should we be doing? And I think both of you can perhaps talk about that as well. Clarissa?
Well, first of all, I think that there should be a change in the legal framework of distinguishing between PMCs and mercenaries, because under international humanitarian law, the status of mercenaries is obscure and vague. So that's the first thing that what should be done. And so determining the status under international humanitarian law, then also in terms of accountability, for instance, in the individual criminal responsibility, the doctrine of universal jurisdiction is very effective, and also in terms of state responsibility, for instance, I think more should be done to get justice done.
Could I add something here? There was, and I think this was March of last year, proposed legislation in the U.S. Congress. It was called Countering Russian Malign Activities. I don't remember exactly, and I don't think it went anywhere. And of course, with the current gridlock in the House of Representatives, it's unlikely that any such legislation will go anywhere. But the problem with trying to do it from here, as evidenced by that proposed legislation and the response to it, it was seen not so much as going after the Russians. It was couched in terms of punishment or sanctions against the African governments who were cooperating with the Russians. And the problem there is that created a negative impact in countries that were not even working with the Russians, and it was anti-Western. And so what I think we need to look at is, how do we find a way to deal with the Wagner Group and other Russian malign actors' activities without creating a whole set of other problems in our relationship with the countries on the continent. And as Clarissa just said, it's a complicated issue. More needs to be done, but I think it really requires people to sit down and come up with some very targeted ways to deal with this, rather than try to treat it with a broad brush, as it appeared the draft legislation that I read was doing. It was not very specific, and it was not targeted in such a way as to be potentially successful.
I see another complication in terms of putting this into legislation, whether it be our own domestic legislation or international law, and that is that our own military has a lot of contractors. Now, for the most part, they're not engaged as armed combatants, they're more security, but I could see where it would be a potentially a slippery slope for us, depending on how you define that and how others interpret the language. So just throwing that out as a possibility. Let's go to our next question. Let's see. Do you think that there is any reason to believe, now this is expanding beyond Africa, do you believe that there's any reason to believe that Wagner could become involved in the current Israel-Hamas conflict, especially given the US historical support for Israel?
It's possible.
Yeah. Okay. Any further comments? I think that's one it would have to be conjecture on our part, and without any real hard evidence at this point. Next question. What is your opinion on the recent reports of Ukrainian special operations forces combating Wagner in Sudan? Would this be a dangerous new precedent for the new state-backed mercenary groups on the continent?
Well, Sudan constitutes another case of the Wagner deployment. In 2017, President Omar al-Bashir signed several important deals with the Kremlin, and including an agreement to set up a Russian naval base at Port Sudan, which could give Russia access to the Red Sea, as well as gold mining contract between company M Invest, a Prigozhin-owned company, and the Sudanese Ministry of Minerals. Following the ousting of President al-Bashir in 2019 and the ongoing political military turmoil in the country, various sources have claimed that through Libya, Wagner has provided military assistance and equipment to Sudan's paramilitary forces and their leader, Dagalo, if I'm not wrong, and his fight over the country's civilian leadership. And according to the international observers, the Wagner Group's main goals in Sudan have been to ensure Moscow's uninterrupted access to Sudanese gold reserves, which is the third largest in Africa, to finance its war effort in Ukraine, to build a naval base at Port Sudan, which could only become possible after the restoration of the Sudanese civilian leadership. Now, since the outbreak of the war in Sudan earlier this year, there have been reported suspicions, we mentioned, of Ukrainian mercenaries fighting on the side of the Sudanese armed forces in the battle against the Rapid Support Forces. And in fact, in April 2023, it was reported that Wagner had supplied the Rapid Support Forces with missiles. And interestingly, Bellingcat began their investigation based on claims of videos that show Ukrainian Special Operations Forces in Sudan. And these videos began circulating online around 6th of October. And Bellingcat is continuing to analyze these claims. At the end of September, CNN investigation reported that Ukrainian special services were likely to be behind a series of drone strikes and a ground operation directed at Wagner-backed militia near Khartoum. The operation involved a series of attacks on the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces, believed to be receiving assistance from Wagner in its fights against the Sudanese army for control of the territory. And what is also interesting is the video footage obtained by CNN that revealed the hallmarks of Ukrainian-style drone attacks, with Ukrainian text seen on the drone controller. And what is interesting here is that the strikes came just about 2 days after Wagner facilitated a large arms convoy to Sudan via an RSF unit in Al-Zurug, which is near the border with Chad. And 2 military whistleblowers from Chad told CNN that the convoy traveled through Chad to Zurug, which would signal an expansion of Russia and Wagner's influence in Africa. And this also shows the potential involvement that it will be verified, is that it shows the even the internationalization of local conflicts.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Another question, this is from a listener in the Central African Republic, is grateful for the comprehensive presentation. Would the change of the group's legal status, if it were potentially annexed to the Ministry of Defense, would that abolish the mercenary categorization of Wagner members? And another question, is the U.S. through the Bancroft Group trying to push back the Wagner Group in the Central African Republic, as some news sources claim locally?
All I can say is that I don't think the mercenaries will change their status. I don't think so, not at all. I mean,
But what if they did, though? What would be the implications of that?
Well, these mercenaries, they are called mercenaries, colloquially speaking, but I'm trying to be careful with terminology, because they're known as PMCs. All right. What colloquially speaking we call them mercenaries. They're talking about regulations of PMCs to have more, because there is no regulation, so that could be useful. But well, if we're talking about mercenaries from Russia, we have an example of what Putin said, that Wagner doesn't exist. And because they do exist, but the problem here has to do with the significant loopholes in the Russia's legislative system. So I don't see them changing the status. I mean, the purpose is privatization and what is known as plausible deniability. So, I mean, that's convenient for states, especially for Russia and other authoritarian countries.
Yeah, they lose their plausible deniability if they're Ministry of Defense.
Absolutely.
And then it's a state engagement. And anything on the Bancroft Group, this news story that that they were trying to push back the Wagner Group?
I don't have information on that. Of course, I'm still, again, researching on this, so I can't answer that question.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How significant was Prigozhin, individually, Prigozhin in Wagner's activities in Africa? Without Wagner's leadership, will the transition to more direct Russian state control be difficult, easy? Will this change the nature of the security assistance, assuming that the colonial-like exploitation of natural resources by the Russians will continue?
So in short, what this question is asking?
Well, the main question here is, how significant was Prigozhin individually? Within Africa? How important was his role in Wagner's dealing in Africa?
Well, it was very important. Well, it's all thanks to Prigozhin that the Wagner is what it is, and it is invaluable to Russia. Mm-hmm. And also the potential arguments about incorporating Wagner into the military, that won't be the case, I believe, because it would, again, deprive the purpose of privatization in the first place and the plausible deniability. But what could happen is, well, there are signs of this already, the greater oversight of Russia over Wagner, and there could be a complete rebranding. But the Wagner model has again left a legacy, and this is all thanks to Prigozhin. Yes.
Yeah, Just a question for me, without Prigozhin there, do you think there's a possibility that other rival paramilitary groups out of Russia could spring up from
Yeah.
even from the remnants of the Wagner Group?
Yes, in my view, there is a possibility that the Wagner fighters will join one of the main competitors, which was Redoubt, and also Convoy, PMC, and they could join them. There is a possibility indeed, yes. And there is also a possibility, as I said previously, a complete rebranding of Wagner. There will be like a new Wagner.
Yeah. Another question. Do you see any possibility that Russia would deploy ground troops if the situation deteriorates in areas where Wagner operates?
It's not convenient for them. No, absolutely not.
And not convenient. Why?
Because involving the military, would take away the advantages that PMCs or mercenaries give. Again, plausible deniability and involvement. So,
is Wagner logistically easier to get to places than the MOD troops?
yes, I mean, you mean by joining them?
Are they more nimble? Are they more nimble? Can they move faster, more easily than MOD personnel?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Is there any indication of Wagner recruiting Africans in large numbers to fight in Ukraine or beyond their local areas? Have there been any indication of local Wagner commanders in Africa seeking to go solo following Prigozhin's death? So this is two questions. First is, any indication of Wagner recruiting Africans in large numbers to fight elsewhere, such as Ukraine? That's the first question. Second question is, any indication of local Wagner commanders seeking to go solo?
Well, there is a possibility of involving African fighters in war in Ukraine. There was a report of there was a human trafficking ring of Cubans that to involve them in the fight with the Russians in the war in Ukraine. So there is indeed a possibility. I do not have a definite answer on that. Anything is possible with Russia. And about the going solo, why? I mean, I don't think so.
Okay. Let's see. There's just a quick comment. Wagner being designated TO. I'm TO by the US. I'm not sure what TO is.
Organization.
Oh, okay. UK and EU financial institutions have the duty to freeze its assets to cut the access to the international financial system. So, in other words, being designated by a terrorist organization by the US, UK, and EU financial institutions, what's the impact of that? The potential to freeze its assets?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there is indeed a possibility that they will freeze their assets, as they've already done to others. Yes, they should.
Do they still have, though, access to, is most of their purchasing in rubles? Are their salaries and whatnot paid in rubles? Question. Let's see, what else? I have a note from, and we have one of our folks has filled in that noting that Phil Vasilevsky, who's one of our senior fellows, and also the director of our new Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare, has co-authored a couple of articles published on hate to plug a competitor, Lawfare, that discusses why the U.S. State Department should designate Wagner as a foreign terrorist organization and the impact that designation would have. I would also note that Phil has written some excellent reports for us as well, so I'll flag those that you can find on our website. Let's see, what else do we have? We have time for one last very quick question. And instead of, I think we've covered most of the questions, so why don't I just, we have about 3 or 4 minutes, so why don't I just ask you, Clarissa and Ambassador Ray, is there anything further that you would like to say to wrap this up and help our listeners understand more about what the Wagner Group is up to in Africa?
I'll go. I think that it would be useful to add about the OAU Convention for the elimination of mercenarism in Africa, and this is important to raise. Mali and Niger are state parties to that convention. Mali is also state party to the UN Convention against recruitment, use, financing, and training of mercenaries. Focusing on the OAU.
Let me just say, it's the Organization of African Union, correct? OAU.
Yes, that's right.
For some of our audience.
Yes, and this convention was signed in 1977 and entered into effect in 1985. But what I would like to mention on this, and I think it should be raised as an example, and I think it is interesting, is that in 1976, the trial of 13 mercenaries took place in Angola, which received worldwide attention. And this was during the Angolan Civil War that began in 1975 after it became independent from Portugal. The indictment first charged all 13 defendants with the crime of being mercenaries. The defendants were also accused of violating 2 OAU resolutions and 4 UN resolutions. And they were also charged with crimes against the peace in violation of the statute of the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal. All the defendants were accused of murders, maltreatment, insults, harassment, even kidnapping of civilians. An indictment also charged each defendant separately with specific crimes. And interestingly, the court convicted all 13 defendants on the charge of being mercenaries. 9 were given prison sentences for death penalty. And the court introduced its judgment by referring the existence of mercenarism in traditional penal law, and it was always dealt with in relation to homicide. And what appears to be is that the court was arguing that when an individual is accused of mercenarism, it's important to look beyond the term and examine the common crimes that it encompasses, for instance, rape, murder, etc. And he recognized that mercenary crime was seen as a common crime aggravated by the profit motive. However, the court held that the mercenarism is provided in their penal code and stated that this annuls the objection of the defense that the crime of mercenarism has not been defined and there is no penalty for it. And the court also stated that the crime of mercenarism consists of specific crimes that exist in all penal systems. And it then referred to the UN resolutions and the statements of the OAU in order to affirm that mercenarism is considered a crime by all nations and that mercenaries need to be punished. However, just one last thing, the courts, just if I may add one thing, is that the reliance on the UN and OAU resolutions has been criticized because, of course, it did not confer on the Angolan court the basis for finding defendants guilty because resolutions, of course, did not create law. But now that we've got the UN Convention, the OAU Convention related to mercenaries, in my view, that makes the case against mercenaries even stronger. And in my view, this trial should be considered as an example.
Thank you. We're officially out of time. Any last words, Ambassador Ray?
No, just to say that it's regrettable that we couldn't get to all the questions, and thank everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you again. And you'll see in the chat box a feedback form. We read the feedback. I read all the feedback. So please fill that out. Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you, Ambassador Ray. And thank you to our audience for joining us today.